GQ didn't just cover a hairstyle. They confirmed something Army's been watching build for months. And if you were paying attention to what happened on Dior's runway in Paris on June 24th, you already know exactly where this story really tipped over into something bigger than a fandom conversation. This isn't a video about one nice photo or one flattering angle under stage lights. This is the full arc, start to finish, of how one man's hair became one of the most talked about style stories in the industry this year. Argued about by fashion critics who have never once mentioned BTS in a headline before, and it all traces back to a decision almost nobody around him wanted him to make. By the time you finish this video, you're going to understand exactly why a haircut turned into a worldwide trending topic 3 separate times in 3 months, and why the person who believed in it first wasn't a stylist, wasn't a company executive, wasn't a fan, it was his mother. Let's start with Paris, because that's the moment that pushed this past the point of being just a fan talking point and turned it into an actual, documented public debate that fashion journalists who have never written a single sentence about K-pop suddenly couldn't stop writing about. Jimin, as Dior's global ambassador, attends the Dior Spring/Summer 2027 show during Paris Fashion Week on June 24th. This isn't his first time at a Dior show since coming back from military service. We'll get to the earlier ones in a minute, because they matter for understanding the full picture. But this particular appearance became something different from anything he'd done before. He's dressed in a replica of an 18th century tailored coat, part of Jonathan Anderson's collection that season, which leaned heavily into historical silhouettes reimagined through a modern lens. Anderson himself described the collection as an exercise in shifting perspectives, in reinvention, in what he called the euphoria of recognition, taking clothing elements from bygone eras and putting them into unexpected juxtapositions with contemporary tailoring. Jimin's coat was loyal to the original 18th century design and spirit, but the tailoring gave it a looser, more contemporary fit than the slim, close-fitting original would have had. And to ground the historical piece in the present day, instead of letting it look like a costume, Jimin styled it with paneled denim and a checkered green shirt underneath. But here's the thing. As striking as that outfit was, it wasn't what people spent the next several days actually talking about. It was the hair, honey blonde, styled into a wolf cut, that shaggy, layered style that blends the choppiness of a mullet with the face-framing softness of a shag. A cut that's been trending across menswear and celebrity styling more broadly over the past couple of years, but rarely on someone with hair this long. Jimin wore it parted simply down the middle, letting the softly blended layers fall and frame his face rather than pulling it back or working it into anything more structured. Fashion press covering the show in real time didn't hold back on how they felt about it. Multiple outlets covering Paris Fashion Week directly called this one of his most memorable looks to date. Full stop, not qualified with any for a K-pop star framing. That's the kind of praise that gets said about looks that actually move the needle in an industry that watches thousands of outfits pass through its calendar every single season and forgets most of them within a week. And then, almost as if the story needed a second act to actually explode, the unedited photos came out. Getty Images released raw shots from the event. No retouching, no selectively chosen angles, no professionally color-corrected lighting smoothing everything over. Just the real, unfiltered images from a live event, captured the way event photography actually looks before anyone touches it up for a magazine spread. And within hours, it split the internet in two, in a way that a normal red carpet appearance almost never does. On one side, you had people going hard at the look, comments about his height relative to the length of the coat, comments questioning whether shorter hair would have suited the outfit better, direct comments picking apart the hairstyle itself, wondering out loud what exactly was going on with it in these particular shots. Some of this played out on Korean forums like Kpop, where fashion discourse tends to be unusually blunt and unfiltered compared to a lot of international fan spaces, and where celebrity styling gets picked apart with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for actual industry professionals rather than casual fans. On the other side, just as loud, just as immediate, you had people pushing back hard on that criticism. One fan wrote directly that people were being unfair, that he looked completely fine in the actual video footage from the event, arguing that still photographs pulled from a live moment tell a different story than watching someone move, talk, and exist in real time under changing light. Another fan wrote simply that he was beautiful, that he'd been the best there, like always. A much more emotional, much less analytical response, but just as forceful in its own way. What you end up with, then, isn't a simple story of everyone loved it or everyone hated it. It's something messier and, honestly, more interesting. A genuine split in public opinion, playing out in real time, with people on both sides feeling strongly enough to actually argue about it rather than just scroll past. And here's the detail that actually matters more than which side of that argument was right. Through all of it, through the praise, through the criticism, through the Thiku threads and the fan defenses and the raw giddy photos circulating everywhere, his name dominated social media for the entire event. Hashtags like Jimin x Dior and Dior Global Ambassador Jimin went trending worldwide. Not regionally, not just within K-pop spaces. Worldwide. Whether people were praising the hair or picking it apart strand by strand, everybody was talking about the exact same thing, at the exact same time, and almost nobody was neutral about it. That's the actual engine behind why this story kept building instead of fading out the way a single Fashion Week appearance almost always does within a couple of days. Controversy, it turns out, generates just as much sustained attention as universal praise does, sometimes more, because people who disagree with each other keep the conversation alive by continuing to argue, long after a purely positive reaction would have quietly run out of things to say. Now, to understand why the Dior moment hit this hard, you actually have to go back further, because June 24th wasn't the start of this story. It was the third major chapter in something that had already been building since March, and once you see the full timeline laid out, the Dior controversy stops looking like a random flashpoint and starts looking like the inevitable culmination of a pattern that had been running for months, quietly, deliberately, across 2 continents. Rewind to March 2026. Gwangwoman Square, Seoul. This is BTS's comeback live performance. The literal "we're back" moment, staged at the front gate of Gyeongbokgung Palace, one of the most historically significant public spaces in the country, and streamed worldwide through Netflix so that fans everywhere, not just the people physically present in Seoul, could watch this moment unfold in real time. This is the first time all 7 members performed together at full scale since finishing their mandatory military service. The first time an entire generation of fans gets to see, unfiltered, who these 7 men actually are now, after roughly 4 years apart. And there, on that stage, in front of that historic backdrop, in front of a global streaming audience, Jimin walks out with hair down past his shoulders. Loose waves, ash blonde, catching the light differently every single time he moves his head, shifting between tones depending on the angle and the lighting rig hitting it. This isn't a quick styling trick, clip-in extensions worn for a single performance and then removed before the after-party. This is a full, deliberate, sustained visual identity, introduced on the single biggest, most-watched stage of the entire comeback era, at the exact moment when the whole world was tuning in specifically to see what these men had become. The reaction is immediate, and it comes from exactly the kind of outlets that don't normally cover idol styling in this much depth. Harper's Bazaar Korea writes that he's completed an entirely new image with the shoulder-length hair and bold, layered styling, not treating it as a passing aesthetic choice, but as a genuine visual reinvention worth analyzing the way you'd analyze a runway look. Digital fashion outlets start reaching for words like ethereal, otherworldly, calling him something closer to a fairy tale figure than a typical pop performer, language that pushes the conversation out of cool haircut territory and into something closer to actual fashion criticism. And then, in a detail that sounds small until you actually think about what it represents, Netflix's own official social media accounts get involved, posting playful comparisons between Jimin and animated characters known for similarly dramatic, flowing hair. A major global streaming platform, with zero specific incentive to promote a single performer's haircut, decides on its own that this is worth a post. That's not something a publicist arranges. That's a genuine, spontaneous reaction from an account with millions of followers, reacting the same way an individual fan account would, because the visual was that striking. That's March. And if the story had ended there, it still would have been a notable moment. But it didn't end there. It evolved, kept building, kept finding new stages to play out on. Fast forward to May 23rd, Las Vegas. Allegiant Stadium. Opening night of the US leg of the ARIRANG World Tour, one of the biggest stops on a tour that was already being described as the largest world tour any K-pop group has ever undertaken. Jimin walks out with the long hair partially braided this time. Thin, precise braids threaded through sections of the loose hair, catching the arena's massive lighting rig in a way that photographed almost unfairly well. The kind of look that seems specifically engineered to be captured from 1,000 different phone cameras simultaneously and still look intentional from every single angle. Within hours, not days, hours, Jimin braids is trending. And this is the detail that separates this from a typical fandom moment. It's not trending within a hashtag bubble that only fans are seeing. It's pulling in engagement from people who have no specific attachment to BTS at all. People who just see a striking hairstyle circulating and want to know more. TikTok fills up almost immediately with tutorial videos, hairstylists breaking down the technique, general beauty creators picking it up simply because it's generating views. It becomes one of those rare pieces of celebrity styling that crosses the gap between thing fans talk about and thing regular people go try on their own hair. And then something happens that tells you, unmistakably, that this had already crossed over into mainstream cultural relevance rather than staying contained inside K-pop coverage. Telemundo, a major Spanish-language broadcast network, with no specific reason to cover K-pop styling news of any kind, has their news anchor Lourdes Steven pay tribute to the look on air during a general entertainment segment, with one of BTS's songs playing in the background as she does it. Stop and actually consider what that represents. This is a national broadcast journalist on a mainstream entertainment segment watched by a general audience that skews far outside the usual K-pop demographic, deciding that a hairstyle worn by one member of a group was worth acknowledging on camera, worth building a moment around. That's not something a fandom can manufacture through sheer volume of tweets. That's a professional broadcaster, independently, recognizing that a real cultural moment is happening and deciding her audience would want to see it too. By this point, ARMY had already given the whole look its own name, Lion Jimin. And once you've actually seen it in motion, not in a still photo, but in the actual footage from these shows, it's not hard to understand why the nickname stuck as fast and as permanently as it did. There's something genuinely leonine about the whole presentation. The sheer volume of the hair, the way it moves and catches air when he throws his head back mid-choreography, the way it frames his face almost like a mane under the specific kind of dramatic stage lighting a stadium show uses. The nickname wasn't a marketing team's idea, and it wasn't something fans forced into existence out of nothing. It caught on because it captured something real and immediately recognizable about the visual itself, the kind of instinctive naming that only happens when a look genuinely earns it. So that's May, Gwangwaman in March, Vegas in May, and now, in June, Dior, the third major flashpoint in a pattern that had already been quietly building across 2 continents before it ever reached the most scrutinized runway calendar in the world. And here's where the story stops being just about styling and starts being about something a lot more human, which is really the actual engine behind why all 3 of these moments landed the way they did instead of quietly fading after the first news cycle. According to a senior executive at Bigot Music, someone who spoke about this directly in a previous interview, Jimin made the decision to keep his long hairstyle despite real, significant internal pushback. This wasn't vague industry gossip. Jimin confirmed it himself, directly, during a live broadcast, telling fans in his own words that when he first brought up the idea of keeping his hair long, nearly everyone around him, company staff included, was against it. Not lukewarm. Not let's wait and see. Against it, clearly enough that he felt it was worth mentioning publicly, months later, as a real part of the story behind the look. And in the middle of all of that resistance, the one person who was firmly, unambiguously in his corner from the very beginning was his mother. It's worth actually sitting with that detail instead of letting it pass by as a cute footnote, because it reframes everything that follows. In an industry built almost entirely around meticulous, layered image control, where every visual decision a performer makes usually passes through stylists, company executives, brand consultants, and marketing teams before it ever reaches a public stage, having nearly everyone around you opposed to a choice is a real, meaningful signal. It means the people whose literal job is to manage risk and protect image looked at this specific decision and saw enough potential downside that they pushed back on it. And Jimin did it anyway. Not because a team decided it would test well with a target demographic, not because some data-driven styling algorithm flagged long hair as a growth opportunity, but because one person believed in an idea, and his mother was the one person who told him to trust it. That's the actual foundation underneath everything that happened next. Gwangwaman happened because Jimin overruled the people paid to manage his image. Vegas happened because he kept building on the idea instead of quietly walking it back after the first wave of attention had already proven it could be a headache to maintain. And Dior, this is the part that really shows how far he was willing to commit. Happened because he brought that exact same instinct onto the single most exposed, most scrutinized, most professionally critiqued stage that exists anywhere in global fashion. A stage where literally every angle gets photographed by professional event photographers, where unedited, unretouched images get released to the public within hours, where fashion critics who've spent entire careers analyzing runway shows are going to have opinions and say them out loud without any of the softening a fan community usually provides. He didn't play it safer at Dior. If anything, the wolf cut leaned further into the exact same identity that had started back in March, at precisely the moment when the stakes and the scrutiny were both at their absolute highest. That's not the choice of someone hedging. That's the choice of someone who had already decided, months earlier, that this was who he wanted to be during this era, and who wasn't going to quietly soften that just because the audience got more critical. Now, to really understand why GQ's piece landed the way it did, and why it wasn't just another outlet jumping on a trend that was already circulating everywhere, it helps to know Jimin's actual history with the publication, because it's longer and more substantial than most people realize. Jimin's individual cover for GQ Korea, from a previous era, sold out within days of pre-orders opening. Not just performed well, but became the #1 bestseller across multiple online retailers simultaneously, topping charts domestically in Korea and ranking at the top of real-time sales charts in Japan as well. That's not the kind of thing a magazine's editorial team forgets. Commercial performance at that level is exactly the kind of data point that gets referenced internally for years, whenever an editorial team decides what's worth a dedicated feature versus what's just chasing a passing trend. So when GQ decides, months into this pattern, after Gwangwoman, after the Vegas braids trending, right in the aftermath of the Dior controversy, pushing the story from fandom spaces into actual mainstream fashion press, to build an entire piece specifically around Jimin's hair. That's not a random pitch some junior editor threw together because a K-pop story was trending that week. That's a publication with direct, proven, financially backed history of what his name does to engagement and sales, recognizing that the same magnetism is happening again, this time centered on something as specific and unusual as a hairstyle rather than a full-styled editorial shoot. They weren't discovering something new. They were confirming something they already had reason to trust based on past performance. And that's really the mechanism behind why this became what people are now calling a global obsession, rather than staying contained as just another fandom talking point that circulates for a week and then quietly disappears. You had multiple, genuinely independent forces converging on the exact same subject at different points across several months, each for their own separate reasons that had nothing to do with coordinating with each other. Korean fashion press tracked it from Gwangwoman onward because it represented a real styling risk that kept paying off instead of fading after the initial novelty wore off. International entertainment press picked it up because BTS's comeback was already one of the biggest music stories of the year, so anything visually striking connected to any member was always going to draw attention. Beauty and hairstyling communities got interested in the technical side. Long, layered hair styled with braiding techniques almost never applied to this length on a male celebrity at this scale, which made it genuinely interesting from a pure craft perspective. Telemundo picked it up because by May it had crossed enough visibility thresholds to register as a legitimate cultural moment. Paris Fashion Week press turned Dior into a sustained public debate about whether the coat, height, and hairstyle worked as a cohesive look. And GQ arrived at the end of all of that, with the institutional credibility and proven commercial history to tie every thread together into one definitive piece. When that piece went up, it did something none of the individual moments before it could do on their own. It gave the entire multi-month pattern a kind of institutional legitimacy that a single TikTok trend, or a single trending hashtag, or even a single national news anchor's on-air tribute couldn't fully provide by itself. GQ isn't a fan account. GQ isn't a K-pop-focused outlet with an obvious incentive to cover this kind of story regardless of its actual broader relevance. It's one of the most established menswear and culture publications in the world, a place whose editorial choices genuinely shape what mainstream fashion conversations about men's style and grooming look like more broadly, across an audience that extends far beyond music fandom of any kind. When a publication with that kind of standing decides one specific person's hair, across one specific era, deserves its own dedicated feature, It sends an unmistakable signal to every other outlet that had been sitting on the fence about whether this was worth covering. This isn't a niche fandom story anymore. This is a real, legitimate cultural story now, and treating it as one is professionally justified. And you can track exactly that shift happening in the aftermath. Style writers who don't normally cover K-pop started weighing in on the broader menswear trend of men growing their hair longer, using Jimin as the reference point their general readers would already understand. Hairstylists with completely unrelated client bases, actors, athletes, musicians entirely outside K-pop, started referencing the Jimin look as shorthand whenever a client described something similar. That's the real marker of a trend genuinely breaking containment. It's not when the original fanbase is excited. Fandoms are excited about their favorites constantly. It's when people who've never engaged with the source material start using it naturally, unprompted, as a shared reference point. Now, it's worth zooming out for a second, because there's a broader context underneath all three of these individual moments that explains why they landed with this much combined force instead of just being three separate, disconnected style stories that happen to involve the same person. BTS's return this year wasn't just a normal comeback in the way the term usually gets used. This was 7 men reuniting after each of them individually completed mandatory military service, a hiatus that stretched across roughly 4 years, during which the group existed almost entirely as individuals rather than as the unit fans had known for the better part of a decade beforehand. For an entire generation of fans, this comeback represented something considerably bigger than simply new music arriving on a release calendar. It represented the process of finding out, in real time, who these 7 people had actually become during years spent almost entirely out of the shared public eye, separated from each other geographically and logistically, separated from performing together, separated from the specific collective identity that had defined so much of their adult lives up to the point they each individually left for service. So every visual choice made during this particular comeback era carried genuine extra weight that it wouldn't have carried during a normal album cycle, because each one functioned as one of the first real, visible data points fans had about who these 7 men actually were now, after everything that had happened during the years apart. And Jimin's hair traced across exactly these 3 moments. Gwangwoman in March, Vegas in May, Dior in June, became one of the clearest, most visually consistent, and most widely documented answers to that unspoken question that the entire fandom, and eventually a much broader audience, had been quietly asking since the group first went on hiatus back in 2022. The through line across all 3 says something specific and consistent. I came back more certain, not more cautious. The years away didn't make me more conservative about how I present myself. If anything, they gave me more clarity about exactly who I want to be during this next chapter, and more willingness to hold on to that even when the people closest to me, professionally, are nervous about it. There's also a genuinely practical, logistical layer to this story that tends to get lost underneath all the trend coverage and social media discourse. But that's actually worth understanding, because it says something real about how much sustained effort has gone into keeping this specific look alive across an extraordinarily demanding schedule. ARIRANG isn't a short victory lap tour with a handful of dates in friendly, controlled conditions. It's stretched across South Korea, through multiple stops in North America, across stadium after stadium, with international legs continuing well beyond the time frame most tours would consider reasonable, and each stop bringing its own combination of humidity, heat, air conditioning, pyrotechnics, quick costume changes, and hours of physically demanding choreography that any hairstyle has to survive intact. Maintaining one specific, recognizable look across that kind of schedule, through sweat, stage effects, rapid outfit changes, wildly different climate conditions city to city, is genuinely difficult from a production standpoint, requiring an entire hair and styling team working night after night to keep the core identity intact while still allowing enough natural movement to photograph correctly under stage lighting. The fact that this is held up as a consistent, recognizable signature across dozens of shows says a lot about how much intentional work has gone into protecting something Jimin fought to keep in the first place. Even if the public conversation mostly focuses on how effortless it looks in any single clip. And it hasn't stayed static, either, which matters more than it might seem. This wasn't one hairstyle introduced at Gwangwoman and repeated identically for a year. It evolved deliberately at specific moments. The Vegas braids were an occasion-specific choice layered onto the longer base look. The Dior wolf cut was yet another variation, shorter layers, a different silhouette, while keeping the same fundamental color that had defined the look since March. That continuous variation is a big part of why this stayed compelling this long, instead of burning out the way most viral beauty moments do within weeks. Each new stop gave press and fans something genuinely new to react to, while keeping the core identity, the length, the color, the silhouette, recognizable across every version. It's also worth mentioning that this isn't the first time Jimin has used a Dior appearance to say something about where he was, personally, in this comeback journey. Back in October 2025, shortly after finishing military service, he attended Dior's Spring-Summer 2026 show in Paris, his first major international fashion appearance since coming back. Wearing an oversized black blazer with no shirt underneath, leather trousers, and layered Dior jewelry, paired with blonde hair already signaling the direction his styling was heading. 2 days later, at Incheon Airport, he wore a soft, cozy sweater from that same collection, radiating a completely different, relaxed energy. Fans and press at the time called him the master of duality. Bold, high-fashion charisma one day, warm and approachable the next, neither feeling like a contradiction of the other. That contrast matters, because it establishes something about the whole pattern we're tracing. Jimin has never treated any single look as the permanent statement of who he is. Each appearance functions as one data point in an ongoing conversation about identity, consistently driven by his own instincts rather than anyone else's caution. And that brings the story all the way back around to where we actually started. Paris, June 24th, the Dior Spring-Summer 2027 show held that particular season at an earlier morning time slot due to an extreme heat wave baking the city that week, staged at the Musée Nissim de Commando, a villa modeled after the Petit Trianon at Versailles. Jimin handled the heat in a blue velvet coat with a distinctly Edwardian air, waving to the crowds of fans who'd started lining up at dawn just to catch a glimpse of him, alongside members of the newly debuted group Cordis and other major names in attendance that day. Inside, guests mingled in the garden trying to catch a breeze before the show began, and by the time it was over, despite an entire guest list full of major names across film and music, it was Jimin's appearance. Specifically, once again, his hair, that ended up dominating the actual public conversation in the days that followed. So here's where all of this actually lands. Once you trace the whole thing from beginning to end, instead of just reacting to whichever single clip or photo happens to cross your feed on any given day, GQ's piece isn't the beginning of anything. It's the confirmation of a pattern that started back in March at Gwanghwamun Square, and that just kept repeating itself deliberately and consistently across completely different stages, different continents, and different levels of public scrutiny, on a historic public square in Seoul, on a stadium floor in Las Vegas, and finally on the single most exposed and most professionally critiqued runway calendar that exists anywhere in global fashion. And in every single one of those very different settings, the story has landed exactly the same way every time. People arguing about it, people defending it fiercely, people obsessing over every single strand and every single variation of it. And Jimin's hair ending up as the actual headline, again and again, completely independent of which side of any individual debate people happen to land on. And underneath every single version of that story, Seoul in March, Las Vegas in May, Paris in June, sits the exact same foundational detail, the one piece of context that actually explains everything else. One member of a group finishing years of mandatory separation, choosing, at every single opportunity, he had to play it safer instead, to bet on his own instinct over the caution of nearly everyone professionally responsible for managing his image. With his mother as the one person who believed in that instinct before any of the rest of the world had even seen it yet, and who ended up being right 3 separate times, across 3 completely different stages, months before GQ ever got around to making it official. So next time somebody tells you it's just hair, remember Gwanghwamun, remember Vegas, remember Dior, remember that nearly everyone around him said no, and one person said yes, and that one yes is the whole reason we're still talking about it right now. GQ didn't discover this story. They just finally admitted, in print, what ARMY already knew back in March.